Hello and welcome back everyone. In today's video we'll be looking at CSS shadows. Now in CSS we have two different types of shadows. We have text shadow and box shadow. So as the name implies, text shadow is the shadow that is around text on your page, while box shadow is the shadow around things like divs and so on. So first of all we'll be looking at the text shadows. So now let's get rid of this and all this CSS styling. You can still leave your define colors. So let's have a p tag here. You can just put text shadow effect. So now in our CSS, let's set this to the h1 tag, so we have something big on our page. So now in our CSS, you select the h1 tag, and to apply the shadow effect for text, you use the text shadow property. Now let's just put in the first two parameters, which is the size for the horizontal shadow, which is the first parameter, and the size for the vertical shadow, which is the second. So this specifies the horizontal shadow and this specifies the vertical shadow. So if we go back into our page, our text now should have a shadow beneath it, just like this. So the more you increase one side, so this is the horizontal, that's the result, and if we do the same on the vertical, the shadow goes down. So just like that. So this is just a mirroring effect. But now there's one more. First of all, let's change the color. So you can change the color of your shadow by passing either just the color name or the color code for that, for whatever color you want to use. So I'm using red now. So our shadow should now be red. So now this is just a mirror, this is just mirroring the text we have here for the shadow. But if you see an actual shadow, it's most times blurry and so on. So now to add that blur effect, add one more parameter. So I can add a blur of 5 pixels, and let's reduce this, the horizontal and vertical components, a bit. And as you can see, that 5 pixels now has blurred the shadow a bit. So the more you increase it, the more blur you get. So if I increase it to 8, the shadow becomes more blurred. And same for the vertical. Let's just take this down a bit. So we have the shadow for our text. Now you can also, when working with shadows, you can also do something like this. So we can set our color, the color of our text, can set it to white, and we can now make the shadow beneath it black to make that text sort of pop up on our page. So we can put this to 2 pixels, so it's just right beneath our text, and we get this nice effect with the text shadow. Can reduce the blur a bit just to have something minimal. So that's it. You can also add multiple shadows to your text, but before we move on to that, using the text shadow effect, you can also add a kind of glowing effect to your text. So for that, you set the vertical and horizontal components to 0, then it can still leave the blur as it is, and like this you get a kind of glow around your text. If you change the shadow to something like green or red, you can see the the glow in effects. You can see something like this around it, or more green. So you can just play around with it and see the different kind of effect you can give your text. Now let's move on to having multiple shadows. Now to have multiple shadows, just like as we have done here, so let's just set this back to have multiple shadows. You can just copy what you already have and add a comma and paste your shadow and give it a different color. So you can change the color here. So we have a second shadow on our text. Let's see how it looks. And so now just a mixture of that, and you can add more. You can just play around with it and see the different results you can come up with. But it's always best to use this in minimal so you don't have something looking too crazy. So now that's it for text shadows. Let's look at box shadows, which is what you most likely be using more when building websites. So for that, let's create a div. So our div, this can be class of card. So we can now have, can call this card title, then with some text. Now let's see our results. Now by default, this is what we have for our div. Let's make this text shadow effect a class name so it doesn't affect our card title h1 tag. So text shadow, and you can just come here and replace the h1 with the text shadow class name. Now let's start styling our card. The first thing I want to do is to reduce the width, so I will set it to something like 500 pixels so it doesn't stretch all the way, and then we can now add our box shadow. So now, just like the text shadow, we have the box shadow, and to start implementing it into your div, you have the horizontal and vertical components for the shadow and the color for your shadow. So I can set a color of gray. So let's add a bit of padding to this box so our content is spaced out a bit from the border. So now this is what we have for the car. As you can see, we have that little shadow there. So now this is just using the vertical and horizontal components, and from the previous example, to add a bit of blur to this, you add on that component, so add a blur of 5 pixels, and now the shadow gets blurred up a bit. But now with box shadow, you can also add a spread radius of the shadow, so that is with a 4th component. So this can be, let's say, 10 pixels. Let's see the result we get. So with this, the shadow gets spread out a bit. I can just tweak around with the measurement and see the results you get with it. Now that's with the box shadow. We can adjust this the components to have a more spread out and even shadow all around this box. So let's set the horizontal to 0. We can reduce the spread radius to 0, so we have a more even and aligned shadows. So let's see the results. As you can see, it's spread out a bit at the sides and at the bottom. So let's also reduce the vertical. Can take this down to 4 pixels and increase the blur. So now you can see we have the shadow at the top, left, bottom and right. So spread that all around. So you can just tweak the measurements that you have here to see the best result that works for you. And to give this a better look, we can add a border radius of 10 pixels so it's more rounded. So now this is our card, and you can play around with your shadows to get something that you can use to display content in cards on your page. So you can also reduce or increase the color, and I personally would also like to reduce the blur of the shadow, so for something minimal. And to make this look a bit better, you can also change the color of your body. So you can just set background color, and to get a good color, I don't know that I've mentioned this in this series, but this extension is very good, Colorzilla. It helps you to be able to pick a color from any page you want on the web, and it also gives you a color picker. So you can come to this color picker panel and select a color that I feel looks good. So this, so that we can just have a bit of distinction with the body and our card. So our card, we can also set this now to a background color of white. So our card and background have different colors, and we can now see the shadow in more effect. So that's it for shadows in CSS. I hope you've learned more, and you can just play around with these measurements, see what works for you and see what you'll be using. Most times you use more box shadows when building the web, because the text shadows can get a bit clunky looking on the site, but you can see what works for you and play around with it. And I'll see you in the next video where we'll be looking at CSS animations and so on. See you there, bye for now.